Paul Williams, thank you for coming on Breaking Politics. Tell us, how much do you expect Clive Palmer to shake up the September 14th election?
Well, already we know there's a lot of interest in Clive Palmer in the UAP. There's a Galaxy poll at the end of last year when the LNP was somewhat in trouble, when Clive Palmer walked away from the LNP after many years' association. And that opinion poll said that 38% of Queenslanders were happy that Clive Palmer was starting his own political party, and 27% said they intended to vote for that political party. Now, I dare say that that initial zeal is going to drop away, and we're going to see that vote come down to much more realistic levels. But I wouldn't be surprised if the United Australia Party, Clive Palmer's party, attracts somewhere around 10% of the vote in Queensland, across all Queensland seats, maybe somewhat less in other states. But Clive Palmer himself will do much better and is in for a real shot, albeit an outside chance, but certainly in for a real shot of winning his own seat of Fairfax on the Sunshine Coast.
So you would expect that after September 14th, the only member of Clive Palmer's party that might be in the Federal House of Representatives would be Clive Palmer?
Yeah, that's right. I suspect that Clive will be the only one who's got a real chance of taking a seat in the House of Representatives. Even the Senate is not looking that good for them, but I'm not really expecting a Clive Palmer UAP blitz across Queensland or the rest of Australia.
OK, if Clive Palmer does run, how much is he going to need the assistance of Labor to get across the line?
Well, that's the key question. Where Labor finishes in the seat of Fairfax will determine not only Clive Palmer and the UAP's future, but how much of a thorn will the UAP be in the coalition side in the federal parliament. Now, Labor polled, as expected, fairly badly in its primary vote in the 2010 election, only in about 27%. Now, everyone's expecting that vote to come down quite significantly, obviously, because the swing is against Labor very much in Queensland. So Labor may poll 20% or even less, which would put them probably in about third spot. I would suspect that the LNP is going to poll around 30 or higher percent, Clive Palmer about 20%, and Labor will probably, or may well, run third. Now, if Labor wants to be quite bloody-minded about this and preference Clive Palmer ahead of the LNP, that would probably put Clive Palmer into the parliament and really upset the apple cart. Now, again, that's not going to damage the LNP's majority. Tony Abbott is still the hot favourite to form a very big majority after September 14. But having someone like Clive Palmer in the House of Representatives needling needling the coalition, and particularly Tony Abbott, on a day-to-day basis, is going to make a very interesting question time.
Lots of interest then in what Labor does with its preferences in Fairfax. So kind of watch this space question. And just before we leave the question of the vote, the Senate, what chance has he got of causing some mischief there?
Well, the sixth Senate spot really is up for grabs. It could be anyone's. We've seen some very interesting Senate results in other states in recent years where we've seen candidates win spots on a minuscule vote. The DLP won a vote in Victoria, won a spot in Victoria on just 2.5% of the vote. Family First 3 years earlier in Victoria on the same vote.
OK, the Bob Katter's chances and his party, presumably you see the Katter threat in terms of numbers post-September 14 as a lot more serious than the Palmer threat.
Well, that's right. Look, I would break down the 6 Senate spots after September 14 at this stage as 3 LNP, 2 for Labor, and that 6th spot will be a direct competition between the Greens, Bob Katter, Clive Palmer, and even Greg Rudd, who's the brother of Kevin Rudd, who's running as a strong independent as well and is getting a bit of media coverage. So that last spot could be really handed to anyone, but at this stage you'd have to say the Katter party is the front runner, where they've got a lot of momentum outside of Brisbane. So Clive Palmer is probably going to run second to Bob Katter in terms of the Senate.
To what extent could Palmer and Katter work together as a force in federal politics, or is that just too unholy an alliance?
Well, at first glance, those two mavericks, we might say, those political mavericks do share a lot in common. They both are defectors, or those who have left the mainstream Conservative parties. They both have problems with the Tony Abbott federal leadership and Campbell Newman state leadership. But if you dig down a little bit further, we realise that they're two very different political creatures. Bob Katter, of course, is anti-globalisation, anti-free trade, pro-tariff, and will always put farmers ahead of miners, particularly in the coal seam gas issue. Whereas Clive Palmer is a miner at heart, who's benefited from globalisation and free trade, and will always put mining interests first. So at the end of the day, these two will not see eye to eye on the basic fundamentals of policy, and while they might occasionally trade off preferences, it's virtually impossible seeing them in any sort of coalition or cohabiting any policy ground, really.
Any thoughts on why Queensland politics in particular produces these mercurial characters at a rate that most of the rest of the country simply can't match?
Well, that's it. Certainly people outside Queensland always say Queensland is different, isn't it? Well, that's not all fantasy. There are some fundamental differences about Queensland politics, and a big one is the fact that the regions control Queensland politics more than any other state. So really, the problem with Queensland politics is that you've got a multitude of interests. As I said, you've got agriculture competing directly with mining. They're both primary industries, but they cover very different bases. So you've got very different constituencies trying to compete for the same vote, and that lends itself to a splintering of the Conservative vote. It lends itself to populist politics going for that lowest common denominator. And that's why we often get very colourful political outfits in Queensland, everything from One Nation on.
Paul Williams, we're very grateful for your time. Thank you for coming on the program.
My pleasure.